koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Mia waroha, Douglas. We all love Douglas. We're all here to remember him today. He is now in a place of darkness, but he will light it up with his power and his personality. He is now one of the crew of Tūmata Uenga, the God of gods, and he'll be there forever. Welcome everybody. Hi there, Ra, my old friend.
Thank you, Lex. Okay, so I'm going to have to stand back here. Can we not move this forward? So okay. Yeah, that's fine, thank you. Okay. Before Doug and I got engaged, we discussed marriage and how we would do things. We discussed mundane things like money, housework, which was very important to me, that it be a shared chore, and children. Doug said he thought 2 would be good. Just as well he said he wanted children, or else the engagement would have been called off. We had our first child, Brendan, and then 3, Brendan, which is, hand up, Brendan. Yeah. And 3 years later, we had our second son, Damien. We then bought our first house. And I said to Doug, we have to have another baby. Because we bought a dining room suite, a beautiful, big, solid pine dining room suite. And so there was Doug at one end, me, Brendan, and Damien. But there's empty space at the back. So we're sitting at the table, and I said, right, we need another one, which is Kirsten. About 4 years later, we're sitting at the table, and I said, Doug, we're still not done. This really doesn't feel like a family yet. So we had Corey. And at the hospital, Doug said to me after I'd had Corey, and I'll tidy it up because there's children, but it was to the effect as, are we done yet? I said, yes. And he said, Jesus Christ, thank God we didn't buy a table that's at 12. So, yeah. So as you know, our 4 children are here today. 3 of them live in Melbourne. So welcome Brenda and Lisa, who goes on these exhausting trips that Brendan organises. And every mountain that you climb reminds me of Doug when he was climbing mountains. And I would be back at the Hermitage, drunk, but going every step of the way with him. You really have your father and you, with your adventurous side and your studious side. He was our little professor. So Damien, and the most amazingly kind and lovely daughter, Narelle. She's been by his side through everything. Couldn't wish for a nicer daughter-in-law. Kirsten, as Doug called her, our princess. And Kirsten, I can recall one night we went out for dinner. I think you were probably about 7 or 8 years old. And when we came home, you said, I've decided what I'm going to be when I grow up. And I said, oh, what's that, sweetheart? She said, I want to be a waitress. Oh, okay. That's very nice. But you love children, you love people. Why don't you go on? Because you need a second qualification, not just being a waitress. You need to go on and seeing you love children, why don't you do something like a kindergarten teacher? You did your training, yeah. And Corey, Corey was the problem one, the last one. He has a wonderful sense of humour. He takes after his father. He used to cuddle and tell Doug, I love you. And Doug was too shy to say it back, even as an adult. So Corey wouldn't let him go until he said, I love you. And Doug would be standing there giggling, saying, I love you, I love you. Yeah. And with us is his fiancée, Karen. Welcome to our crazy family. So there we are, that's our family. Doug was born on the 27th of December 1941 in Hamilton and was raised in Rotowara, a small coal mining town south of Auckland, where his parents owned a general store. Doug was the second child of 4. He had brothers Ray and Roger, who are both deceased, and his much-loved sister Lynn, who is with us here today. In the early 1950s, they moved to Auckland, where Doug completed his schooling and then entered Lincoln College in Christchurch to do his horticulture diploma. Doug played the guitar and sang mainly folk music, but he joined a rock band and they played at many venues throughout Christchurch. When he left college, he wanted to make money to go on a hitchhiking tour around Australia. So he worked at many different jobs, nurseries, ministries of works, abattoir, crematorium, until he saved enough money, came over here for a working holiday and hitchhiked around Australia. On his return to New Zealand, he again worked at many places. He used to skite that he worked at 29 jobs in 5 years. He was hired as a landscaper for the Hermitage Hotel at Mount Cook. Doug enjoyed mountain climbing and became part of the search and rescue team, where he helped many lost or injured volunteers. A new resort was being built at the Franz Josef Glacier on the west coast, so Doug was loaned to them to do landscaping of the grounds. It was there that I met him when I got a job there at the hotel. There wasn't very much to do at the hotel because it was just on its own. The nearest town was about, in those days, 20 miles away. But we had a staff pub, and many a day after work, that's where I'd find Doug and his mates. Had to look hard as empty cans were stacked high on their tables. So if we weren't drinking in the staff pub, we'd drive 20 miles to the local pub, where we always had to enter by the back door. As in those days, hotels closed at 6. But one of the first people we ran into was the local cop with a beer in his hand. And he didn't seem to care, or the fact that most of us were underage. Excuse me. When Doug had to return to Mount Cook, I also left and I went back to Christchurch. And Doug rang me and said, oh, there's a job going here, the Hermitage. So I applied for it, got the job. We had the same sort of lifestyle there as we did at Franz. Really good times. A year later, we moved back to Christchurch, got engaged, and both of us worked in factories to save money for our weddings in 1968. 18 months later, Doug was offered a job in a strawberry garden in Auckland, so we moved there with Brendan. When the season finished, a few months later, Doug got a job at the local council managing their nursery. And when the council closed the nursery, Doug went to work at a factory that canned corned beef, Spam. Oh my God, did he stink when he came home. I used to hand him a cup of coffee at the back door. When he'd finished that, he'd strip off downstairs. We lived in the country. He'd strip off and race in and have a shower. He finally decided to take on the lease at the nursery that the council had, and we grew native plants there for a few years. And then when it came up for renewal, we decided that we wouldn't do it. So Doug went landscaping. He then applied for a job at the Quarantine and got that job. We then moved to his parents' property in the Henderson Valley in Auckland, which was on an acreage, and they had a vineyard orchard, and we planted Market Garden. And Doug continued to work for Quarantine until he went through a midlife crisis. Sorry, folks, got water. So he chucked his job at Quarantine and bought a lawn mowing round. That way he could look after the grapes, the market garden, etc. Unfortunately, we had a massive flood. The whole crop was destroyed, the market garden, everything. So Doug rang up quarantine, asked if there were any jobs available, and they said, yes, you can start tomorrow. From the mid-80s, we holidayed in Australia and finally decided to move here. We absolutely love the wildlife and the trees. And I recall while on holiday, when we were staying at Broadbeach, we saw bats for the first time. The next day, we went for a walk and ended up at the Cascade Garden Bat Colony. Never ever did we imagine in the future that we would be revegetating that site. The first job that Doug applied for over here was with quarantine, but when he was told he'd have to do training, he refused, as he was the training officer in New Zealand. So he brought a lawn mowing round again. Oh, I hated that. I used to pray for that lawnmower to break down so I could sit down and have a rest. A few months later, we bought a convenience store. And in 1992, there was a bad flood on the coast, and many houses that were near Lotus Creek were inundated with water and raw sewage. Our beloved councillor, Dawn Critchlow, called a meeting of residents which Doug attended, and this was the start of the Lotus Creek Catchment Association. I would look after the shop while Doug attended meetings and working bees. Then we sold our shop in 1994, and I joined the group as well. After selling our shop, Doug did a Train the Trainer course and was hired by Leslie One's Training Academy to teach botany and horticulture, which he also taught at TAFE. Doug, when he was younger, joined the Forest and Bird Society. So from a young child, he loved the environment, and he passed that love on to many people. He was a great teacher, as he'd just walk around pointing out, naming birds, trees, and animals. And even when teaching at TAFE, he always taught outdoors. They had asked for class plans, but Doug said, no, it's all in my head, and I won't teach in a classroom. And after much discussion with the powers that be, they agreed. Many of the people he taught, whether it be TAFE, work for the Dole, Green Corps, went on to TAFE to do horticulture diplomas, or in quite a few cases, a lot of them went on to university and did environmental degrees. When the job at TAFE finished, Doug was employed by Tamborine Mountain City Council, now known as the Scenic Rim. We'll be talking about Doug's time there. We also started up an environmental consultancy business. This was at a time when our council cared about the environment, and we worked all over the coast, Sunshine Coast, New South Wales, and future gold mines in places like Moranbah and overseas in Dubai. When Damien got his degree, he then assisted Doug, and then we were joined by the lovely Narelle. We loved doing this job, and often said if we didn't need the money, we would do it for free. So we helped out many groups who needed advice or assistance. We would just charge them no cost. Yeah. All this while, Doug continued with the Lotus Creek revegetation. He did all the plant lists for our projects and attended every working bee. Now, those of you that know Doug know he was not perfect. And there was one major source of many disagreement between us, and this was his dress sense. Or in his case, absolute lack of dress sense. We'd be going out shopping, dinner at a restaurant, friends. Doug had come out wearing an oversized red polo shirt, green shorts, thick blue woolen socks, and so-called best sneakers. I would object, and he used to say, well, you can just do what you always do. Walk six paces in front of me or 6 paces behind me. I didn't realise that he knew that I did that. Yeah. Anyway, we came to a sort of agreement where I put out clothes for him to wear. This was never without a grumble as to why do I have to wear that stuff. Now, whenever we went to America, Kirsten would be ringing and making sure that Doug packed his good clothes through because we'd be going to a nice restaurant. So I'd get his clothes out, put it on the bed, and what do I need to take these for? You're going out for dinner. Yeah, but these ones will do. You're going out for dinner. Pack the bloody clothes, Doug. Yeah, his actual words were, why the heck am I wasting space in my suitcase for this stuff? He had plenty of room for his tatty clothes, though. One time when we were in Paris, not Paris, we were in the USA at Palm Springs, and Doug wanted to be dropped off at a conservation park. So he was wearing his old tatty clothes and a tatty old backpack. And we arranged to pick him up. When we picked him up, he's standing there leaning against the bridge and he's laughing. I said, what's so funny? He said, well, I was looking underneath the bridge and there's all these homeless people that are under there, living there. And one of them saw me and said, we've got room for your mate down here if you want. Do you remember that, Kirsten? Yeah. Absolutely mortifying. Absolutely. Yeah. I can also recall we arrived in Las Vegas about 1 o'clock in the morning. And you know how you have those shorts that you men, they have elastic, but they'll also have a drawstring as well? Doug never tied that tight enough. And we've come out of the airport, we were walking over to where the van was to take us to the hotel. Doug's pushing a trolley with our suitcases on it. He says, hold on a minute, what's the problem? Turn around and look. Bleeding shorts were down around his ankles. Oh my God. Yeah. He also had an amazing memory. He used to be able to read a book. When we first came over, he said, oh, I love all these palm trees. I'm going to learn them. He bought books. He rented books from the library, read them once, and he knew every single palm tree. But introduce him to someone? No, he could never remember their names. So we had this method where Doug would say, well, look, I'll just leave you two and you can introduce yourselves. So that's what we did. Doug has left us and future generations to come as directly and indirectly he's been responsible for planting hundreds of thousands of trees here on the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast, Logan and Tamborine has been involved in many publications as well. Inside the community garden here we have a lot of native plants. So if you'd like to take one, and those of you that are working on projects would like to place one there in Doug's memory, we would really appreciate that. If not, if you've got room in your garden, please help yourself to a plant. Doug always used to enjoy Kirsten, and when she'd come up to stay, and he'd be talking about it for days before, oh yes, we'll be having a wine. Kirsten always used to share a wine with her dad. So Kirsten has set up an area inside the summer house, which is the big double shed down the back, but we grace it with a good name. So if you'd like to have a drink with Kirsten in memory of her father, we'd very much appreciate. So thank you. Thank you for listening. And now I'd like to invite Will Book. Where are you, Will? Will was ranger on Tamborine Mountain when Doug was up there. So you'll be talking about that, Will? Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Nice to see everyone today. I had the good fortune of knowing Doug for 20 years, and I was part of the interview panel that interviewed him for the job as escarpment project officer on Tamborine Mountain. And it was a hotly contested field, I can tell you. There was my high school biology teacher, Barry Janke, was in there, and Barry's a very, very good naturalist. But the moment we met Doug, we knew we had our man. He had that amazing ability to talk to people of all ages, classes, and just completely disarm them. So he was the perfect fit. He could talk to the rural producers, he could talk to the mayor, he could talk to the brothel owner and one of the biggest escarpment landowners on the mountain, and get him to agree to fence the cattle out and protect a lovely little waterhole on the escarpment. We achieved amazing things with Doug's assistance and that ability to bring people along with him, which was just amazing. He was one of the best naturalists I've ever worked with. I reckon my top 5, Dougie's up there. If not number 1, very, very close. So he knew everything from, as you said, the birds, the exotic palms, the native palms, the birds, the insects, the dragonflies. And when you've got that ability to go right across plants and animals and do your bird list by sound and things like that. So time spent in Doug's company was a great learning experience, and you'd bounce stuff off each other, and I can see why he was such a fabulous teacher, you went away at the end of that day a better person and a more knowledgeable person for being in Doug's company. God bless him. And I love the photos. That is Doug like a pig in mud. That is Doug at his absolute happiest. And what he contributed for us at Tamborine Mountain over that decade, because he continued to work for Landcare after the escarpment project finished. He worked for Landcare. He had a council continued to fund his position, and boy, do we miss him today. If those jobs are still so important, even more important today. But it seems that it was easier to get an environmental outcome 20 years ago than it is today. And the work that you, Doug, your family have done, Loaders Creek, the survey work, the plantings, Doug's memory lives on and will live on for a long time into the future, and we'll be reminded of that on a regular basis. So the other thing I sort of admired about Doug was how relaxed he was and comfortable in his own skin. Many of us aren't, and we're constantly challenged. But Doug just had that vibe about him that he was absolutely happy in what he was doing, and that zen about being in the moment was one thing Doug taught me absolutely. So thank you very much, Doug.
Thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to invite Councillor Dawn Critchlow, a wonderful, supportive councillor. If it wasn't for her, chances are we wouldn't be here. Thank you, Dawn.
Thanks, Jeannie. Oh no, I'm thrilled to be here today, remembering, hello Sally, remembering Doug, and what I've learnt just when Jeannie was doing her speech, what I learnt, he was always in touch with the ground. He was always in touch right from day one. That's what he wanted. He wanted nature, he wanted the trees, he wanted everything natural. And even the way he dressed was very natural. So, but he was a wonderful person. I got to know Jeannie and Doug, and Jeannie mentioned it in her speech, when we had all that rain in 1993. I'd been on council for a couple of years, and it was 1993, and I got a phone call, I'll never forget this, from a lady at number 21 Baratta Street. And I went out to her house, and she had sewerage coming up the toilet, up and over the sewerage. And wouldn't be going to do it again after that. That was the first and last time. And then Journey got two and started the community garden, and as you see it today, it's a beautiful garden. And she even convinced them to put the electricity on, which I don't think many people could have done. And so we've got, and then they went into the edible garden, is it Bush Tucker Garden? And I remember once I came here and there was a bus with Russians in it. They were spending next to no time on the Gold Coast, but they wanted to see the edible garden. And then the butterfly garden, of course, over there's somebody walking through the butterfly garden at the moment. That goes right down to the next little park area. And they planted thousands of butterfly trees there. That's on the old railway track where the train used to come down from Brisbane. That was the track in there. So none of this can ever be touched because it's got that heritage value to it. But Doug was a really, really nice person and worked with the family. The whole family are nice people. Written books, many books. I forget the names of them, but I've got one in my office. I'm not very good at reading, but I like the pictures. I didn't bring Princess Pookie today. My little Princess Pookie, I didn't bring her today. Somebody else bought theirs, so I'm envious. But Doug, a beautiful person, and as I say, from day one, I can see that his life going up, but always in touch with nature all the way through. So we'll miss him, and you look after yourself, Journey, and the family, you look after Journey, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Dave worked with Doug a lot, knew him well. He admired you immensely. I'm not going to go on because I get upset. Okay, come on, Dave. Yeah. I must just say too that Dave went to visit Doug when he was in the nursing home, and used to take him to a beautiful park across the road, and would take him for a walk over there, which Doug absolutely loved, to be out there amongst the trees. Oh, sure. Bring that up.
That's the Doug that I'll forever remember. I just want to take you back to pardon me. Will. Put a bit of will in me. Okay.
Focus on just one person.
Take you back to when I first met Doug. It was a different era, the early 90s. There was no federal laws, there was no state laws on the environment, there was no vegetation management on the Gold Coast. It was free-for-all. Developers pretty well did what they'd always done, and that's what they called speculative clearing of the land to see if it was developable. And there really was open slather. It was early 90s that I met Doug, and I'll bring you back to that moment at the end of my jittery talk. Back in those days, when the law started to come into play, of course developers didn't want to know about the extra costs that it would take to find out what was on their land. So people didn't want us on their land. So we were, I guess, always having to fight the reason we were there, and people didn't like what we found. One of the things that I learned from Doug, I agree entirely with Will, just being with Doug, you would learn by osmosis with God. But one of the things I learned from Doug was never to say never. Never don't find something. If there's something on the property, you've got to tell what's there. Our job, our role, wasn't to have opinions about things. It was simply to be a messenger. What is on this property? What is important about this? And what can we do within the limitations of what was being proposed? What can we do to have the best outcome? And so that was something we always strive for. As a result, we'd have people that wanted us on their land because of what we could do well. Eco Village at Grumman was a good example. We spent many, many days on the Eco Village, and that was a unique situation. for a lot of reasons, and sadly Chris Walton, who drove that whole scene, is no longer with us. But that was one person, Chris Walton, who was a developer amongst developers. He wanted to do everything he could to preserve the values of the property. So it was a delight for Doug and I to work for someone like that who actually wanted us to be there. The converse is also true. There'd be people that didn't want us there because of what we would find. Early in the piece, I'll draw to a close now, but early in the piece there was a lot of environmental good happening, if you will, in a lot of sense. There was a thing called the Environment Advisory Group with Gold Coast City Council, for example, and I think, Councillor Critchlow, you're a member of that group for some time. And I'll bring you back to the first time I ever met Doug. It was a pretty important group. For me, I was a sort of newbie on the block. I was finding my own way. I was a member of the Australian Conservation Foundation at the time. That's what got me on the panel. And there's some pretty important people sitting around at that meeting. You know, the Deputy Mayor, there was Ian Glue, David Power, David Corkill, Shireen Mitchell. I don't know if these names mean anything to anyone. There's some pretty influential sort of people, all in their nice squabber, except for Doug. Doug Cook was there, if anyone knows Doug Cook. Darragh Larson, Shireen Mitchell, I think I mentioned. Anyway, and I'll draw to a close now, but again, that's the Doug I know and love. He was probably dressed in, I don't think he was as dirty as that, but he was sitting back at the meeting and hadn't said anything. I thought, I wonder who this guy is. I forget exactly what the conversation was, but suddenly Doug just leaned forward and said, "That's bullshit." And from that moment, I knew I liked this guy, and Eddie's been a strong part of my career. Again, we've done a lot of work in the past, and I'll sorely miss him. He was certainly someone to hold up in high stead, and thank you for today and for allowing me to say a few words. Doug will always be my role.
Thank you, Dave. I'll now throw it open. I know Don would like to say a few words. Right, Don? Kirsten, can you move your chair side out of the way and let Don through?
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm getting a bit on the shaking old side, so if you'll excuse me, I'll look at a few notes, if I can get them to start with. Yeah, it's all right, it's me. Let's see. Brilliant. I've learnt a lot about Doug today, actually. I didn't know anything of his early life, and Jean has filled me in on that.
Some of it.
And I didn't realise how many jobs he's had. But I met Doug 20 odd years ago, and I admire him. I admired him greatly. Excuse me. Doug was a special person. He was quiet, unassuming, and gentle. I was in awe over his ability to identify in a flash most plants and animals, but I was amazed by his ability to recognize a bird song or flight, and even more, that he could lift up his binoculars and go straight to a bird in a tree without moving them anywhere. Straight to it. I've never known anybody do that before. He was an awesome spotter of anything that moved on the ground, in a tree, or in the air. He loved plants, he loved animals, and he loved wildlife. And as already been mentioned, one of the best things that ever happened here was that Doug was involved from the beginning in the formation of the Lotus Creek Association. He was a founding member. Doug was so immersed in his love of wildlife that he reminds me of Edward Lear's poem. There was an old man with a beard who said, "It's just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren have all built their nests in his beard." Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Damien? Thank you, Damien.
Thanks all for coming, folks. It's great to see everyone today. I've just got a couple of quick stories. Obviously, growing up with Douglas was a great experience, particularly concerning natural history and wildlife and fauna and plants and everything. One of my earliest memories was when we were growing up in Auckland in New Zealand. Following any big storms that we had out on the west coast, out Piha and Murai, some of the beaches out there, which are beautiful spots, black sands, they feature in a lot of TV shows, etc. So after a big storm, we'd head out there and have a look around. We'd get out there early in the morning usually. But we weren't looking at the lovely scenery and the sights or the surf or anything. We were out there looking for dead birds. After a big storm, all the pelagic birds would die on the unfortunately starve to death or get blown in. So we'd be running around as kids, sort of 7, 8 years old or younger, trying to find these birds for Douglas to find. And then he'd get his calipers out and measure the bill and the wingspan and write it down in his trusty notebook, which he always carried. And then, unfortunately, some of them were above the high tide line, so we'd pick them up, and because we hadn't got there for a week or so, obviously the flies, and there'd be maggots on them and all sorts, but that didn't dissuade him. He'd measure them up and write them down, and quite often we'd take them home, and they'd end up going to the Auckland Museum as specimens there. Later on, I became interested in insects, particularly ants, and Douglas always taught me that, no, don't learn the common names. People get confused with common names. So it was never a little red ant, it was Calendar antarcticus. It wasn't a big red ant, it was Mesoponera castanea, and that's not a black ant, that's Tetramyrmex albipes. He ensured that I learnt that, and that carried on with cicadas and everything else. Shortly after that, we came over here on trips to Australia, and I was lucky enough to then work with him, of course, for well over 15 years. But when we first moved here, we didn't know the species, so I was lucky enough to learn all the frogs and the reptiles and everything with him, which was obviously the great experience. One of the interesting stories was, as Jean said, we owned the shop up the corner here for a while there, and then we sold that, and Jean still worked there part-time afterwards. So just about 500 metres up the road, there's a little park there with a depression that fills up with rain following heavy rainfall, and there's a couple of species of frogs that breed in there. So sometimes, unfortunately, the water would evaporate, and the tadpoles wouldn't get a chance to develop into frogs. So anyway, one day a woman walked into the shop and told Jean that earlier that day she'd seen a rather large hairy man down in this little pond with a butterfly net. She saw him scooping things up and putting them in a bucket and taking them home, and she thought maybe he'd caught something, he was going home to take it home for dinner, or breakfast or lunch, who knows what. But Jeannie had to explain to her that no, that was her husband. He'd been down there collecting tadpoles to try and save them from dying. So he had a bit of a reputation around the place. The other thing I remember is obviously working for him for a long time, and some of the jobs we did were very steep and you know, a lot of hard terrain, etc. When he turned 65, which was sort of mid-2000s, I remember, you know, it was 40 degrees, walking up a hill, all our gear, buckets, traps, everything. saying to him then that there's no bloody way I'll be digging holes and putting pitfall traps in when I'm 65. And then 5 years later, when he turned 70, he was still doing the same. So I repeated the phrase. And of course, he worked right up into his early 70s with us doing those surveys, which was fantastic. The other thing, whenever we turn up to the house there, he'd be on the deck just like that. Do you want to should we put the jug on? We've got time for a coffee. So there was always time for a coffee and he'd get the jug on. If we turned up around lunchtime, he'd put on lunch, but we had the choice of egg sandwiches, ham sandwiches. If we were really lucky, it was egg and ham sandwiches. Or if we were truly lucky, he would have made a batch of cheese scones. Now, his cheese scones were, in his mind, pretty famous. It wasn't so much the quality, but the quantity. There was at least always 3 or 4 dozen. They were sort of that thick, and you could use them as doorstops. But he was always very proud of the way he made these cheese scones. So that's something which we'll have to keep trying to make if we can in the future. A few years ago, back in the mid-2000s, we were lucky enough to turn up a frog species just a kilometre that way or so, the green-thighed frog, first time on the Gold Coast. Then we were doing a management plan for that. So, and they only breed after really heavy rain, 100 mils, 150 mils. So we'd after heavy rain, we'd bring Douglas or see, has it been raining down here? No, it hasn't rained yet. Anyway, that evening, he and often Jeannie would, or the next morning, they'd go down to the pond there and listen for the frogs. And they'd call Narelle and I on the phone and hold the phone up to the chorus of these green-thighed frogs going off. So we'd nip down and we'd do all the surveys with it. And there's some photos of that you'll see shortly anyway. In recent years, although not well, he'd always ask us, what we'd seen. We've been surveying or camping, etc. His favourite species was the yellow-footed antechinus, which, for those who don't know, it's a little mouse-sized marsupial. It's quite a voracious little animal. And he loved to tell the story of his surprise back in the there's nothing like that in New Zealand, so we'd never seen one before. Back in the mid-1990s when Jeannie and him were starting the business and working, they'd set these Elliott traps and looked in them in the first one morning, and there was this beautiful little antechinus in there. And when he was in the home recently, we printed out a photo and put one on his wall as he requested it. So now Narelle and I, when we do our surveys, we've vowed to always think of him whenever we're lucky enough to catch an antechinus in one of his beloved Elliott traps. Thank you very much.
We were up in Springbrook, Doug and I, doing a survey up there, and because Doug plodded along, at his own leisurely pace, so I'd sort of go ahead of him and I'd check the traps out, the little Elliott traps. Anyway, I said, there's something in here, Doug, so he comes up, opens the trap, and we'd put a plastic bag over the end of the trap, the Elliott trap, which is about that big, and opened the trap door, and into the bag fell this beautiful antechinus. And so looked at her, and she had 12 little babies attached to her nipples. And when we released the bag and let her go, she took off at huge speed with these little antechinus bumping their backsides on the ground. I thought, my God, we're going to end up with 12 disabled antechinus. Yeah. I also nearly fell down a cliff that time. We always seem to have lots of accidents out there, didn't we, Dave? If it wasn't Doug, it was me, or if it wasn't me, it was Narelle. You seem to be pretty sturdy most of the time. Yeah. So is there anyone else that'd like to have a word? If not, we'll go to... Sally. Thank you, Sally. Sally is head of the Wildlife Preservation Society, a great stalwart for the whole of the Gold Coast, who's been involved for many years. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you. Everyone knows that Doug was a past president of the Wildlife Society and followed in the footsteps also of Barry Johnson and of course Fred Short, that wonderful centenarian. People will be glad to know that we in the Wildlife Society are grateful for the knowledge and the watching that comes from the naturalists, and the kind manifestation of care that comes from our councillors. People will be glad to know that Councillor Dawn Critchlow, from whom this area has benefited so much, passing on the ability for Doug and Jeannie and others to preserve this area, they'll be pleased to know that in spite of the efforts to slash the Southport area into two, the Electoral Commission has deemed it fit that Southport, which is the area which Dawn has protected and nurtured in spite of the selfishness of many interests that have dominated this council, that area will not be split. And I know many people have been anxious on Dawn's behalf because she has done so much for the people of the area. She cares about people, and in turn she cares about the people who care about wildlife, and she listens to them. We know that Doug and Jeannie also have watched over the Pine Ridge Reserve, which was brought into existence by Margaret Thorsburn, our founder of the Wildlife Society, and the many people who watched over that area. The watching brief of those people who follow in the natural world has been so important. For the Wildlife Society also, we have followed, as I've just mentioned there, the wavering political direction which puts so much of our planet in peril and imperils the future of these young people who come here today. And it is the watchers and those who try to translate them into the politics of the time that will help our planet. But what will also help us is our faith in God, the stationary arks, which, like this one, still exist, those who watch over them. And we know that Doug, in his own way, will be watching still the natural world which he loves so much. So blessings to Doug and Jeannie and to all their family. Thank you.
Hi, Jeannie. Could I just say something?
Yes, just sit. There we go.
Hello. I'm Glenys Owen. I worked with Doug at Beaudesert Shire Council. For the 10 years prior to 2000, I'd been hired in at Auckland City Council as an ecologist and town planner, and I was in charge of the Hauraki Gulf Islands. I moved to Australia, got the job at Beaudesert Shire Council, and I seemed to be a lone voice in the wilderness, wanting to protect the environment. I was so grateful to have Will, because trusted soul with the same heart. And then I met Doug, and I was so thrilled. He was a Kiwi, like me. And then, my first outing with Doug, I was very, very excited. And he took me to the rubbish dump on Tamborine Mountain. And yes, it was all the Latin words, like Biden's Pelosa for Copper's Peg and stuff. And I thought of all this beautiful environment around. He takes me to the rubbish dump. But I learned a lot there. I learned what weeds were. Because like Doug, I'd come from a different natural environment, and it was the start of a wonderful friendship. And I'm very grateful that Doug was hired as a contractor with Will's help for those 3 years I worked at the council, and I'll never forget him. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I say something?
Yes. Natalie is David's better half.
Thank you. Yes, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Natalie Hoskins. I'm director of an environmental consulting firm here on the Gold Coast, and I just wanted to acknowledge the contribution that Doug has made to achieving so many conservation outcomes here on the Gold Coast through his work as subcontracting with environmental consulting firms. So that's another arm of Doug, and I think it's important that that we acknowledge that as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the legacy that Doug has left, and we have Damien with us, and I think that's just a wonderful thing. So thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree, Damien. I can recall at about 18 months of age, he'd be outside with his bug catcher, catching ants, and then Doug built you the glass ant house, which sat in the garage with a big packing shed at the valley. And then you became interested in cicadas. And we took a trip from the North Island in Auckland, and we're going down to the West Coast and the South Island. We had the windows open. And every time we heard a cicada, we had to stop, get out of the car, go and catch the cicada. And that night, the motel, Doug would put it into a jar with a bit of alcohol in it, and then you pinned them all out. Doug would name them for you. And then when we got back to Auckland, Doug took you to the Auckland Museum. And the entomologists there were able to fill in those names. So Damien's quite correct in saying that Doug taught him the true name for everything. And I said to Doug when he was about 4 years old, he speaks Latin better than he speaks English. Yeah, it was just amazing. He had the same thirst for knowledge, the same love, which has continued through to our other children as well. So thank you everyone so much for coming along here today. And Corey has put together a slideshow of Doug from childhood upwards. And after that, we'll have morning tea. No, we'll go to afternoon tea. I haven't had any lunch yet. Yeah, okay, thank you. Corey.
Yeah, should be good. As I hate speaking in public, I'm going to keep this, much like Douglas, short and sweet. So I've been having a think about what I'm going to say ever since Jeannie called to say that Douglas had gone. And it is definitely very hard to put into words what we say about a person, let alone one's father, but I appreciate everybody showing up today and all the kind words that people have said. I'm thinking about whether or not I should say my favourite memory, or my last memory, or maybe even my first memory, like when he used to put me on his lap and let me drive the car down the driveway at Henderson Valley. But the thing that gets to me the most is that as I look at the TV screen and it says Douglas's date of birth, the 27th of December 1941 hyphen 31st of May 2019, that hyphen, even though it's just a tiny insignificant piece of grammar, it actually represents his whole life. It represents when he became a son, it represents when he became a brother, it represents when he became a friend, a husband, a father, and it represents all the people that he's met along the way and all the lives that he's changed. But it is so much more than that as well. It's his mannerisms, and we're all aware of Douglas's mannerisms. And those mannerisms I think of every time I see certain things. So every time I'm driving along and I read out every single sign on the side of the road, yep, I got that from Dougie. Every time a member of our family stands up and says, just got to go to the toilet, nobody asked, but that's okay, because that's a Dougie as well. Wanting to leave the restaurant as soon as you'd finished eating, that was definitely a Douglas. Every time it would rain, he'd say, great day for the ducks. And of course my personal favourite, if you ever said every little bit helps, he would need to follow it up with, that's what the old lady said as she was peeing in the sea. Now, Douglas loved his UK comedies, things like The Two Ronnies or Open All Hours, Keeping Up Appearances, Faulty Towers, Absolutely Fabulous. We could go on and on and on. He loved them all very, very much. So I think probably the best way that we could say goodbye to Douglas is to give him the Benny Hill salute. So if you don't know it, you put your hand to your head and give us a smile. Thank you all. Now, I'm not in any way, shape or form musically talented. Douglas got that gene and he kept it and didn't pass it on, but I do have a fantastic brother. I actually have two fantastic brothers, but one of them in particular introduced me to a gentleman named Eric Clapton, and he wrote a song that just sums up how we all feel about Douglas. And with the help of Narelle and Karen and Damien and everybody else who supplied photos, we've put a little show together for you. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
I've got a watch, which I can't get into. But I'll be alright if I wear that on the arm like that. It would be. Oh, gee, it's not easy. I'll tell you what, they make it very difficult for you.
The camera.
Go to the camera, look at that.
Oh, where's that? Can you see mine?
It's, oh, yeah.
Will it stay away?
No, it's just away. No, you won't.
Through the distant clouds of tears, I'm like a bridge that was washed away. My foundations were made of clay. As my soul slides down to die, how could I lose him? What did I try? Bit by bit, I realized that he was here with me. I looked into my father's eyes, my father's eyes.
legs. I've got the trifle. I'm just walking around the trifle. See that? Trifle. See that? Trifle on there. See? Cust is falling out the edge, falling over. Down like that. See that? Cust is falling out the edge, all over the carpet. Lovely, isn't that? See that? We get the cleaners in next week.